All right, today we're diving into a real clash of the titans. On one side, you have the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, championing human reason above all else. And on the other, you have the theologian Joseph Ratzinger, who you might know better as Pope Benedict XVI. And the battleground for their debate? It's all about a single, huge question. What is worship really all about? Let's get into it.
So this really gets us to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? Is faith just this warm, fuzzy feeling? Something private, maybe a little outdated? Or is it possible for faith and reason to actually work together? As you're about to see, the answer to that question really, really depends on who you ask.
Okay, so before we can really get into the fight, we've got to set the stage. We need to understand the traditional view of worship, the one that the Enlightenment was really pushing back against. And this whole perspective is built on one powerful ancient idea that kind of frames the entire universe.
And that idea is logos. Now, this is a huge concept. For thinkers way back in ancient Greece and for early Christians, logos wasn't just a word. Think of it more like the divine operating system of the universe. It's the underlying reason, the order, the divine meaning that's woven into the very fabric of reality. It's the idea that everything isn't just random chaos, but an intelligent, understandable whole. And this is exactly where Ratzinger picks up the thread. For him, the absolute peak of worship isn't just about going through the motions. He calls it a spiritual worship. And what that means is that we, as rational beings, consciously take our own reason, our personal logos, and align it with that greater, cosmic, divine logos. It's like we're tuning our own minds to the very frequency that creation itself is broadcasting on. So in this view, you can kind of see the history of worship as this evolution inward. It starts with external stuff, sacrificing an animal on an altar. But it moves towards something way more profound, something internal. It becomes the act of offering your very self, your whole mind and reason, to God. And that is seen as the ultimate expression of faith. But of course, this way of thinking didn't go unchallenged. Not by a long shot. A massive intellectual earthquake was about to hit, and it shook these traditional ideas right to their core. And that brings us to part 2, the Enlightenment's challenge. We're talking about the Aufklärung here, which is the German Enlightenment. This was the era of I think, therefore I am. It was a whole movement that put human reason on a pedestal as the one and only judge of what's true. And look, this focus on logic and evidence led to incredible scientific breakthroughs, but it also meant that anything that you couldn't prove in a lab was suddenly suspect.
And what this new way of thinking did was put traditional religion right under the microscope. The big idea from these Enlightenment thinkers was that, hey, maybe the only part of religion that's actually valuable is its ethics, the moral code. Everything else, all the rituals, the prayers, the whole shebang, a lot of them just dismissed it as superstition, a leftover from a less enlightened time. And nobody held back, especially not a guy like the philosopher Immanuel Kant. I mean, look at his words. He called traditional prayer a superstitious delusion. And by fetish making, he basically meant that people were treating prayer like some kind of magic vending machine. You put a prayer in to get something from God, instead of doing the actual hard work of being a moral person. For Kant, the only thing that mattered was following the moral law inside you.
Okay, so let's put these two worldviews right next to each other. It really couldn't be more different, could it? For Kant, worship is basically a distraction from what's really important, morality. At best, it's a moral solemnity, a nice little gathering to think about being good. But for Ratzinger, worship is the most important work. It's a real, genuine encounter with God through the offering of your entire self.
And Kant really doubles down on this point here. When he says the cult, he just means all the formal rituals and ceremonies of worship. He's saying they're irrelevant. Why? Because the only thing that has real value is your internal disposition, your personal commitment to doing the right thing. The external stuff in his view just doesn't matter.
And Kant wasn't some lone wolf here. This was a major trend. Another giant thinker, Hegel, was right there with him. He also argued that real, authentic worship has nothing to do with ancient rituals. It's about living a life guided purely by reason and what she beautifully called its flower, the moral law. Basically, religion just becomes ethics with better costumes. So you've got this massive intellectual takedown of traditional worship. What's the response? Well, this is where Ratzinger comes back in, and his move is pretty interesting. He doesn't just reject reason. No. He argues for a much bigger and what he would call a deeper understanding of what reason can actually do. And Ratzinger's counterpunch is, well, it's pretty sharp.
He basically says that this whole Enlightenment project of creating a religion based only on pure reason was totally artificial. He calls it synthetically manufactured, like a lab-grown religion. And he says it was so weak, so fragile, that it vanished like a soap bubble the second it faced a serious critique, even from a thinker like Kant himself. Now, this is a super important point. Ratzinger isn't anti-reason, not at all. He's against a small, boxed-in version of reason, one that says the only things that are real are the things we can measure in a lab. He believes that for reason to be truly itself, it has to be open to the transcendent, to the possibility of realities that go beyond the physical world we can see and touch.
So his vision for what real worship looks like kind of unfolds in these 4 steps. First, it has to be logos-filled. It's got to make sense. It has to be rational. Second, it has to involve your whole self, your emotions, your mind, your body, not just your inner moral scorekeeper. Third, this kind of holistic worship makes a real encounter possible, an encounter with a God who is utterly different, not just a reflection of ourselves. And finally, he says, it's that encounter that gives people the strength to actually deal with all the messiness and challenges of real life.
Okay, so what's the big deal? Why does any of this matter outside of a philosophy class? Well, it turns out the stakes are pretty high. This isn't just about how you pray. It's about 2 totally different ways of seeing yourself and your place in the cosmos. From Ratzinger's perspective, if you go all in on the Enlightenment view, you end up in a pretty lonely place. If you follow Kant, you're left standing all by yourself, trying to live up to this incredibly demanding moral law with no help from the outside. If you follow Hegel, you risk turning God into nothing more than a voice inside your own head. And the end result of all this, Ratzinger warns, is a state of almost isolation. So when you pull it all together, you realize something crucial. This whole debate, it was never really reason versus faith. It's a much deeper argument. It's about 2 totally different visions of what reason is even for. Is reason just a calculator, a tool for science and ethics, and nothing more? Or is it more like a window, one that's capable of looking out onto the mystery and meaning of the universe itself? And that's the question I want to leave you with. Our world today is, in so many ways, built on the foundations of the Enlightenment. We value reason, science, and morality, and for good reason. But this old debate forces us to ask a tough question. In a world that prizes reason so highly, what, if anything, do we lose when that reason has no room left for the transcendent? What's the cost of a world without worship?